Hello and welcome again to the Life in the Cave podcast, where we try to work through the nonsense and the lies, noble and otherwise, that you've been seeing this week in the news, in your culture, at your dinner table, wherever it is that you're seeing nonsense and lies. We're going to try to find those nonsense and lies, and we're going to try to expose them, talk about them, and see if we can't get to something that resembles the truth. Today is Monday, November 2nd, the day before the election. And because of that, we are calling this episode the election episode. I titled it Build Back Better Great Again, combining the two phrases, catchphrases from both the campaigns that we're going to be talking about today. I will say there is certainly a lot to talk about this today with the election coming up tomorrow. I cannot. I'm not joined today by Micah. Unfortunately, he is. I don't even know what he's doing. He said he couldn't join me. We were talking about maybe doing some post-election coverage or something like that. So if that's something that interests you, definitely tune in tomorrow at some point, or Wednesday, I guess. Yeah. So I like to start out some of these episodes with a little bit of philosophy, because there's no guarantee that it's gonna end up with all this stuff we're talking about. There's no guarantee that it's gonna end up on in the midst of the podcast. So what I wanted to talk about today has been something I've been thinking about a whole lot, and it's this push that has been just so rampant this election cycle to get out and vote. And now, of course, I have no problem with democracy, and I have no problem with people telling other people to vote. I think voting is a good thing, and I think without voting, we're in worse shape than we would be if we weren't in a democracy. For the most part, I think a good, um, like a theocracy, or maybe some kind of a monarchy where things are really perfect, like a perfect ruler, might be kind of cool. But by and large, we have a lot of stability with the democracy, so I like it. Anyway, people are telling people to go vote, and now mostly it's Hollywood, mostly it's brands that are sort of virtue signaling with the vote situation. And the way that they make it seem is that you're just going to die if you don't vote. They make it seem so important that you vote, and they make the consequences of an election so extreme that they've got people probably freaking out. I mean, I know a lot of people don't like Donald Trump, a lot of people don't like Joe Biden. That's fine. But if either of these people get elected, if your worst nightmare comes true and the other guy gets elected, it's really not the end of the world. The Stoics said something that I really appreciate. This is Epictetus, who is a Roman Stoic later on, maybe 300s AD, somewhere around there. And he talked about the fact that you could be in jail, you could be essentially being tortured. Like, lots of bad stuff could be happening to you, and you can still be happy. And the point he was making is not that you want bad things to happen to you, but the point he was trying to make is that these external factors that you have no control on shouldn't be things that we really worry about. We really shouldn't be worried about stuff that's going on outside of the world that's not internal, that's not close to home, at very least close to home, but otherwise that's not inside your actual head. Like, you should be happy regardless of what's going on. And now how we get to this happiness is another question for another day, but it's certainly important to say that this election is not going to shouldn't change your life. It shouldn't make your day any worse. It shouldn't make your year any worse, and you really shouldn't be too concerned about what happens, because really the most important things that are happening in your life are happening in the places that you are, not far away. So I always want to bring that up as much as possible when we're talking about elections, because really there's just no reason to make this sound so big. There's no reason to make this sound like it's the end of the world. It's not. If Trump gets elected, it's not the end of the world. If Biden gets elected, it's not the end of the world. And these Hollywood people are lying to you. They're trying to make you feel really nervous and really scared, because they know that the scared people are probably going to vote. the way that they want them to vote. And it's the same thing with the news. We talk about the news all the time on this podcast. That's basically what it's about. The news wants you to be scared. They want you to think that everything is going to be terrible for you, and that sort of thing sells. You know what I mean? That sort of thing makes people afraid and makes them react. It makes them spend money, actually. At least that's how I understand it. So that's that. That's my little shtick on the election and on why you shouldn't be worried. If you're in the room, please hit like. I do appreciate it. Trying to get some more people in the room. I think there's also a button that has to do with, sharing or something like that. I don't know. Hit all the buttons, and hopefully we'll get some more people in the room. But boy, we've got a lot to talk about with the election. It's coming up. You might notice on my screen there is a space to your, I don't know which way it's actually showing up, to your right, I think, to my right. And that is the space that I'm hoping to put some screenshot things on. Hopefully that works out. I'm not really sure if I've figured out the OBS studio well enough to make that work, but hopefully it will. Where to start with the election? Well, actually, let's not start with the election. Let's start with everything but the election, because at least once that's over, we'll be able to stick to important things, or rather pertinent things, as we transition into the election. I want to talk about COVID. We talk about COVID fairly often here. It's the same stuff every single time, but it's important to bring up that we are being told, again, like what I was saying earlier with this fear situation, we're being told that COVID's worse than ever. We're being told that everyone's going to die. We're being told that, I think Biden said it's going to be a dark winter, that everyone's just in for it. And we know, depending on how this election goes, we're going to see either restrictions amp up or restrictions go down. And we also know that based on the models and all that stuff, they're telling us if the restrictions go down, if people stop wearing masks, like 10,000 people a day are going to die, or something ridiculous like that. I don't believe that. I think that the deaths are not matching at least what they were doing at first with this COVID thing. The first wave, so they say. The deaths and the ratio of deaths to cases was a lot bigger. It's not as big now. They say, it's the most cases we've ever had, but the deaths aren't matching that. They are going up, I will say, and of course, no one wants anyone to die, but I wouldn't say that it's necessarily something that you should really be too afraid of. That's just my opinion. And I do have a COVID clip, I think. No, maybe I don't have a COVID clip. Regardless, just be aware. They're going to tell you it's going to be bad. It's going to be the worst thing that ever happened. It's just not. So I wouldn't worry about it. Frankly, I wouldn't. Now, who is worrying about it is every other country in the world. In France, they're talking about locking down again. Paris, I think they've already locked down. In New Zealand, well, that was a clip I had. I think I have a New Zealand clip. Do I have a New Zealand clip? I think I do. Where is it though? Yeah, okay. So the Prime Minister of New Zealand's a woman, and she's talking about these COVID camps. Let me pull up this file here. And this might be a little loud. These COVID camps are essentially what they're doing now. If you test positive for COVID, they're putting you in essentially like a concentration camp. I'm not exactly sure how it works, but with these camps, you get tested, and when you get tested and you test positive, you are released after a certain amount of time. But in these camps, they have, well, I'll just let it play for itself.
If someone refuses in our facilities to be tested, they have to keep staying. So they won't be able to leave after 14 days. They have to stay on for another 14 days. So it's a pretty good incentive. You either get your tests done and make sure you're cleared, or we will keep you in a facility. longer. So I think most people will look at that and say, I'll take the test. I've got a number of questions about people refuse. What do we do if someone refuses to be tested? Well, they can't now. If someone refuses in our facilities to be tested, they have to keep staying. So they won't be able to leave after 14 days. They have to stay on for another 14 days. So it's a pretty good incentive. You either get your tests done and make sure you're cleared, or we will keep you in a facility.
So, yeah, just be grateful. I mean, I don't know where you are, in what country you're in, but chances are you're not in New Zealand. Be grateful you're not in a place that's making you take tests to escape the clutches of the government. That's no good. And all the other countries are getting behind this sort of thing. And I personally believe, I don't even think it's really a conspiracy at this point. I believe that there are certainly globalist incentives to the COVID-19 stuff. I think that there's definite reason to believe that these people are consolidating power and that they're using this virus as a way to control people. I think with Build Back Better, for instance, we're seeing an example of how the countries are capitalizing on COVID-19 and what sorts of things they're hoping will happen because of COVID. So, for instance, they know they can lock you down. They've talked recently about locking down because of climate change. If everyone's in their house, then there's fewer carbon emissions. So they're talking about doing that sort of thing. They're talking about tracking people with these apps and these tests and these cards that you carry. There's plenty of things that they're trying to do based on COVID that are going to be in place even after COVID-19 dwindles. After a vaccine comes, these infrastructures are still going to be in place. And when those things are used for other purposes, we're going to start seeing freedoms diminish. That's what I believe. I think that this is, maybe it all started with good intentions, but I think the way that it's going now, we're going to see some freedoms in both America and across the world being diminished. We're going to see people not quite as free as they were before COVID-19. So, what does that mean for us? I think it means personally, if I'm advising, don't get a test. Unless you're dying, I guess. Don't download any apps, any contact tracing. Just try to stay out of it as much as possible. That's my personal opinion, and that's really all we can do. I think that there are some protests and stuff that are going on for COVID, but by and large, I'm not sure that's going to really do anything anyway. But who really knows? So that's the COVID stuff. I think as far as it goes, expect there to be more. Expect the cases to go up, even the deaths to go up a little bit. But I don't think that's necessarily cause for concern at this point. I don't think, they mentioned, for instance, in El Paso, hospital beds. I think we talked about this last week. Hospital beds are, filling up, and they've got camps outside hospitals. And, there are reasons for that. They're picking up people from across the border on these bridges to put them in hospitals. And that's a good thing. I think we should try to treat people if possible. But I don't think that there's too much concern about, you get to a hospital and you're not able to be treated. I wouldn't worry about it. So let's transition into the election. I want to talk about the election in a couple of different ways, a couple of different facets in which we can talk about it. The first is what's actually happening in the election and how we're supposed to interpret it. So if I can get into OBS and I can add my screen capture, I don't forget how to do this. Okay, boom. I messed up here. Just put it right there. That's fine. And let's look at the maps. So looking at this map, we're seeing what the 270 to win people, what the pollsters are thinking is going to happen from their polls. And we'll talk about the polls in a little bit, but as you can see, it's pretty decisively Joe Biden. Now, just to explain what's going on in this map, we know blue is Biden, red is Trump. Light colors of the same are leaning or likely, and then we have these brown tan colors, and those colors mean that there is a toss-up. These are the toss-up states. And if you look at what they're thinking is happening across the election map, you're seeing that with the certainly blue, likely, and leaning, Biden has it without needing any of the toss-ups. So this is what the polls are suggesting. Now, do I think the polls are correct? That's the first question that we have to answer. And there's a lot of people that are talking about the polls and asking questions like, are they reliable? Is there a reason to believe that the polls are not giving us the full picture? And I don't want to necessarily come down on that in a way that I know more than anyone else, because I frankly don't. But I think that there's something to say about last election and the way that polls, I think, have been used just in general, the way that polls have been used to sort of become a weapon. So we know the media outlets, and we know that a lot of these polls are run by media outlets. We know that these media outlets are biased. It's been so clear for the last forever. For the last 4 or 5 years, we see that there's really nothing that would help Donald Trump, coming from CNN, coming from MSNBC, whatever, any of these media outlets. And we know that these are the outlets that run many of these polls. Now, there are some independent polls, but by and large, I think we can assume that the polls are maybe not partisan, but the polls are run by partisans. And we know that these people want Trump to lose. They want Biden to win. So looking at these polls, the question is, can they help, right? Is there anything that a pollster can do? Or is there anything that a polling website, polling company, whatever they call it, can do to affect the election? And I think if we look at these numbers, we're going to see maybe there is, right? So I'm going to throw that back on the screen. I know there's probably a better way to do this, but I don't know how to do it. So I'm going to throw this back on the screen. And when we look at this map, I think that polls sort of have an interesting role to play in the morale of an election. So if we're looking at polls, think of polls almost like, I don't know, like the yard signs that people have in their yards. You know, I don't think anyone's ever seen a sign on someone's yard and been like, oh wow, now I'm gonna vote for whoever. Now I'm gonna vote for Biden because I see this really cool yard sign that says "Buy Don" and it's really cool. That's not the way that these yard signs work. That's not why they're there. So what is the yard sign for? Well, it's a morale booster. It's getting the people amped up on that side. If you're going around, all you see are Biden ads, Biden signs, you're gonna be like, oh wow, it looks like Biden's gonna win. You know, I'm looking at all this stuff. It looks like this guy's gonna win. The same way if you see Trump stuff all over the place, oh wow, it looks like Trump is gonna win. And I think the polls, at least to some extent, play a similar role. That is to say, I think that the polls do something other than tell us who's going to win. I'm not saying that they don't do that, and I'm not saying that they fail at that, but I am saying that there is an element of morale that has to do with polls. So that's why I think you see polls doing this weird thing where early on the disparity seemed really big. Like if you check the polls a few weeks ago, it was like this massive disparity. It was just so much space between Biden and Trump. It was like 20 points. I don't really know. And it was right around when he got COVID. Everyone was saying, "Oh, it's done for. We're done." And then it started to narrow, and it's starting to narrow. And in fact, it really didn't narrow like I even expected until today. There's a lot of narrowing that happened even today. And you ask yourself, why is that happening? Are a lot of people changing their minds? Are a lot of independent voters all of a sudden just becoming Trump supporters? No, I don't think that's the case. I think what's happening is that these pollsters have this desire to show, this big, it's like an army outside of another, an enemy castle, and they have this desire to show this really impenetrable, overwhelming force. It's, it can't be stopped. And then once the actual election is coming, they start to do something different. They start to basically hedge their bets and like, well, if it does go the other way, we definitely don't want to be caught out on this. We want to say, oh, well, we pretty much predicted it. And that's what happened at the end of the last election. People came and they saw really big disparities. They said Hillary has an 80% chance of winning or a 90% chance of winning. And then we saw it kind of get a little closer, and then, oh, it's neck and neck. Well, who'd have thought? Now it's neck and neck. So I think when we look at polls, we have to think that there is some agenda with the polls. Whether that affects the final considerations of the polls, or how much rather that affects them, I'm not sure. But I think that it's important to see them as political tools just as much as it is to see them as a way to determine the outcome of an election. But as we look at the polls, we have a completely different question to ask. And let's look at the polls if we can. All right. So this is what they're thinking. They think this is the 270 to win. I'm sure you can see everything on my screen. They think that this is essentially what's going to happen. And what they're saying is, even with these toss-up states, these brown or tan states, it doesn't really matter. If Trump wins all the toss-ups, he is still going to lose. And so they've put Trump at a very severe disadvantage in this election. And that's entirely possible that he is at a severe disadvantage. But what we're here to look at is the individuals. The first thing I wanted to do is look at the 2016 race. So this is the 2016 race, and let's see if we can get these both up on the same screen. That would be really cool. Can we do that? I hope. There we go. Is that showing up? Let's see. Is that showing up for you guys? Yes, it is. All right. So here's 2016 on your right, and here is the projection for us here. Now you'll see that there are a couple of differences. The first difference is that Trump is winning on this one and Trump is not winning on this one. But what we have to deal with is these states, well, pretty much all these states. So they're looking at Arizona being a Biden state. Now, if we look at the actual polls for Arizona, we see that there is a 2.2% lead as of November 2nd. So that's pretty recent. Now, these have gone down. 2.2% is obviously within the margin of error in this particular circumstance. So that was the wrong button I hit. So Arizona and Nevada is whatever. So Arizona is the only real question on the West Coast, but Arizona would be sort of important. Arizona would be important. Now, looking at Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, these are all your toss-up states here, and these are going to show up right up top. Georgia, where's Florida? Florida, and did I pass North Carolina? Yeah, North Carolina. So, boy, we got a 2% here. 0.2%, 0.3%, and Florida, Biden's up by 3.1. So in 2016, he won all of those, and they're suspecting that these are the toss-ups for this time. Now, I will say, those have a pretty tight margin for either, but it's also true that Trump could win these and still lose the election. So the real questions in my book are Iowa, Michigan if possible. Michigan's pretty far out there. Ohio and Pennsylvania. If Ohio and Pennsylvania go, that's a big deal. So let's look at Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, as of yesterday or today, is up 3.7. I'm not sure what the margin of error for these things is, but I think it's around 3%, they say, for these polls. And that sounds about right. I think that there is certainly a lot of reason to believe. I mean, if you look at the 2016 for Pennsylvania, I don't think I can get that information here. I mean, it was close. It was like 49 to 49 sort of thing. It was really close. And that's the consideration of Pennsylvania. There's two main metropolitan areas in Pennsylvania. There's obviously Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, but there's a couple of smaller, Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, stuff like that. And those are the ones that are going to lean blue, and then your more rural areas are going to lean red, and that's just the way it ends up being. But I think that if he wins Pennsylvania, then all bets are off. So when we're looking at the presidential polls, I think that even as we think about where are we here? Even as we think about these sorts of things that people are saying, like, we just have to really be careful, because there's just no reason to believe it's as cut and dry or it's as landslide as people are saying. So I wanted to play a couple clips as it pertains to the election, and kind of talk about polls, kind of talk about the election, and that's what we'll do. So the first question we have about the polls is, like, what sorts of things can give us some pause about the polls? And I think the main thing that people are talking about is this idea of this Trump shyness, where people that are Trump supporters just don't really want to talk about their support for Trump. So if a pollster calls and they say, "Who are you going to vote for?" They're like, I'm undecided. Or they'll just, not answer pollsters. In fact, the first clip I have is actually people not answering pollsters, which is sort of significant. Where is this? This is here.
The problem is, since 2010, people quit answering polls. Yeah. So we went from like a 50% response rate down to a 2% response rate. For folks out there, that means 98% of the people who are asked to participate in a poll refuse to do so. That, as Pew Foundation identified 10 years ago, they said that means we no longer have random sampling. And if you no longer have random sampling, that means you're no longer getting representative sampling. And so and the best example of this right now is the New York Times. They said this is how many people said they've already voted, and here's what the Democratic margin is. Well, the polls are wrong in every single state, and they're wrong by an average of 25 points. In other words, they were predicting 50-point Democrats. The University of New Hampshire said that there's an 80-point lead by Democrats in the early vote. Well, we have the early vote data from Democratic vote modelers who have the data and the information. They say it's about a 20-point lead. In Michigan and Wisconsin, the New York Times said that the Democrats were up by 40 to 50 points. It's dead even amongst the early vote. So we already know their polling was wrong. And to give you an idea of how significant that is, Biden's entire lead in all of these New York Times polls was amongst people who said they had already voted. He had no lead amongst those who hadn't voted. Those are the core problems with polling fundamentally. They're the least reliable form of data. The problem.
So that's a significant point. If true, that most people, if they get called by a pollster, just hang up. So you're only really getting to talk to the people who want to talk to pollsters, and there's no real reason to believe that the people who want to talk to pollsters are necessarily an even distribution of the electorate. Um, that's tough. And also, he said that there's some disparity between what the polls thought about the early voting and what the early voting numbers are actually showing up with. So that's going to be the first question is, what can we actually expect from the polls? And then really, I mean, the next question, in my opinion, is what happens if Trump wins? Like, when do we finally just say, like, you guys are unable to conclude anything with any certainty? Will there even be polling anymore if he wins? I mean, it would be a pretty serious loss for them. If you're in the room, please hit like and feel free to chat. I'm happy to talk to anyone who's in the room. I like the contribution. It helps me to move things along. So if you have anything to say, I welcome it. But as we're talking about polls, I had another thing, and this is that talk about the shy Trump voter. And I'm not sure exactly how far we can take this, but here's the clip, and then we'll talk about it. This is a C-SPAN call.
Lauren, I live right up the road from Baldwin Wallace, and I take great issue with some of the comments you're making on there today. In fact, I finally had the nerve to put my Trump sign out in my front yard. My neighbors are also Trump fans, and they're too scared to because of radical Democrats. They're worried about getting a brick thrown through their window or paintballs shot at their home. So, and I totally disagree that where you're saying Joe Biden is leading in the suburbs, and I think that's just fake. And I think you're just trying to see what you want to see with your research. So I totally disagree with your comments, and I'd like to hear your response.
Well, here's my response. Whatever political predispositions I might have or my colleagues might have at the Community Research Institute at Baldwin Wallace University, more than anything else in the world, we want our polling to be accurate, and we take great measures to make sure that it is. And so my comments on Biden leading in the suburbs are based strictly on the data and not on my opinion. Some of the things that we do in our polls to make sure that we are not underestimating Trump support in Ohio is that we weight by education so that people with without college degrees are represented in the sample. And we also have caps in place on the urban and suburban vote. So the rural vote is not underrepresented in our polls. So everything that I'm saying is based strictly on the numbers and not based on what I'd like to see or what my political predispositions might be.
So the guy had a good point in that you never know what sort of crazy thing is going to happen when you align yourself with a political party in this day and age. There's just no knowing what's going to happen. He said you get a brick through your window. You can get your car keyed. That's totally possible. And that's why, and I see a lot of businesses that put up signs, whether they're Trump or Biden signs. I would never do that if I had a business, because you're literally alienating half of the people that could be coming to your business. So there's a lot of anger and there's a lot of negativity surrounding these elections and these candidates, and I don't think there's really too much benefit to publicly aligning yourself with these things. So to say that there are people who might say on a poll, I'm not sure, or who might say on a poll, I'm voting for someone I'm not voting for, it's totally possible. I don't know if there's, I guess by the end of it all, we're going to see what happens. But it's definitely possible that the polls are off. In fact, yeah, it's definitely possible. But let's see how confident these people really are as we look at. Let's see. This is Chuck Todd. Him talking about how likely it is that Trump will win.
It's pretty dumb.
Look, I would say this. I'd rather be betting the money line. I know
Right.
Biden's the point spread favorite. I'd
Right.
rather bet the money line than and see if he would cover a spread. Look, I do think I'm one of those that's going to say it this way. If you hold the election 10 times, I think there's only one, maybe two occasions that Trump wins. I think there's 4 occasions that Biden wins in a blowout, and I think there's 4 occasions where it's a nail biter, but he wins. I think that the most where we're really headed is I think it's possible that all of the battleground states, when you're watching us on Tuesday night, everything
Yep.
feels competitive and close.
Yep.
And whether it's Florida, whether it's Iowa, whether it's Wisconsin, and everything will feel within that 3 to 5 point range. And you're like, boy, I don't know, but it looks like it's, and then it all tips in one direction. And then Biden could get to that, 350 to 400 electoral vote mark. There is an outside chance.
All right, there's no way Biden is getting to a 400 electoral vote mark. 400. If that happens, well, then I'm wrong. But I can't see it as being possible.
He could touch 400, and that would mean carrying Texas. I still think there's a lid on Texas of about, a 47 or 48 for Democrat, that at the end of the day, he's just going to come up a point or two short. But I'll say this. I think the adjustment that many pollsters have made, I know the adjustments we've made to make sure that we feel good about our numbers, but a lot of these other, I think if we're wrong this time, we might be wrong in the other direction, meaning we may be there is a chance we're underestimating Biden.
Yeah.
I think there's
well,
more of a chance we're underestimating Biden than what we did 4 years ago. But the biggest difference is that he's an incumbent, and he's just not given the benefit of the doubt the way he was when he was a challenger. And that, how voters think. Be simplistic about this. Incumbent in a year where things aren't going well, incumbent loses.
That is a good point, actually. There's a lot to say about what 2020 has looked like, and just in general, that is a true statement. That if it's a bad year, the president's going to lose, and that is probably the most persuasive thing that I've seen about what could possibly happen. I will say, I think the problem with that, with this idea of it being a bad year, is essentially just who you ask. There is a contingency of people, a large contingency of people that think that this year was bad because Donald Trump made mistakes. So his actions led to the things that caused all this bad stuff to happen: the shutdowns, the COVID deaths. But there's also a pretty large contingency of people who don't believe that, who think that there's just no correlation between the president and the bad stuff that happened. It's just the way that it was. So that's going to be the question: is who thinks that it's Donald Trump's fault, and is that group large enough to carry this election? The other thing I want to talk about here is this idea of a blue shift, or you're seeing the word shift and mirage in the news as people talk about the election. And what this basically is talking about, the mail-in votes. So the idea of a mirage and a shift are essentially the same phenomena. It's that early on you're going to see Trump winning, essentially, because the votes as they're tallied in real time they're suggesting are going to be more Trump votes. And then as those mail-in votes are counted and aggregated and sent in, then you're going to see this blue shift. You're going to see Biden pick up, and you're going to see his numbers go up. And ultimately the question surprise to anyone. So I do wonder how well prepared they are, and I just hope that, particularly if these mail-in ballots are being sent out to the municipalities that they were cast in. Like, for instance, if I'm voting in a small town, who's counting that? Is the capital counting that, or is the small town counting that? So if they're all sent out to where they belong, to the different districts, you should think that it shouldn't be that hard to count them. So I think that the numbers are going to come in, and I think the numbers are going to be pretty okay. Like, I think we'll get a really good view of who's going to win by the end of November 3rd. Now, they're saying that's not the case. A lot of people are saying that's not the case. But I suspect that, particularly because of the craziness that can happen, I think that we're going to see those numbers in quick enough. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm excited to see. I'm excited to follow it, and we'll get behind it. We'll see. I want to talk briefly about the aftermath of what happens in this election. I wanted to talk about the possibility of the Trump victory. I wanted to talk about the possibility of the Biden victory, and what would happen. So obviously, the best case scenario for everyone is a blowout, right? Someone wins by a whole lot, and there's really no way to contend with that answer. So that would prevent a lot of the craziness that happens with people like Trump refusing to give up the office, or with rioting and looting, or whatever is going to happen. I think there's going to be unrest regardless. But in a tight race, I think it's going to be potentially devastating for the country, because if it's tightly won by either side, neither is going to accept it. And when I say the side, I mean both the candidates and the constituents and the people who are very tied up in this election. So if it's really close and Trump wins, I think you're going to see a lot of rioting. I think you're going to see a lot of civil unrest, and I think that's not good. But I also think that if Biden wins, you might see some shenanigans on high levels. You might see Trump attempting to get the election in other ways, whether it be through the Electoral College, through kind of shady stuff with that, or through the Supreme Court. You know that he's talked a lot about how he doesn't believe the mail-in ballots are good. He thinks there's a lot of fraud. So he's obviously set his pathway. He's figured out how he's going to respond should it not work out. And that is yet to be seen. I can't say that I'm really confident in what the country is going to look like no matter what happens. I've heard a lot of talk, and I'm sort of thinking it might be true, that if Biden wins, Biden's going to be out of commission quickly. I think people are expecting it to be the Harris administration as opposed to the Biden administration. In fact, there's a funny clip. Let me see if I have it. Yeah, this is Joe Biden.
My name's Joe Biden. I'm Jill Biden's husband, and I am Kamala's running mate. You all think I'm kidding, don't you? My name's...
So he says, I'm Joe Biden, I'm Jill Biden's husband, and I am Kamala's running mate. So he's on it too. He knows that he is. I think the word was a Trojan horse. Like he's the guy that's going to get her in. He seems like a nice enough guy, but I don't think anyone's voting for Biden because they really like Biden. I think they're voting for him because they really don't like Trump. But all that to say, tomorrow's going to be a crazy day. I'm excited for following all this stuff, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to get back and touch base with everyone after the election. I'll be planning to talk about. Hopefully Michael will be back. I'm really hoping, because it's obviously a lot more fun to do this with him than it is to do it by myself, but the show must go on. So I want to thank everyone who has watched up until now. I want to thank everyone in the room right now, and I want to encourage you to check out our content, check out the stuff on our YouTube channel, and also check out our new website, www.60secondphilosophy.com. If I think of it, I will link it below. So again, thanks for watching, and I will see you all really soon.